Dr. Neighbor.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Black Health Trust. We are so happy that you have chosen to spend some time with us. There is always so much going on. There's always a lot that we need to talk about, but time won't allow us to talk about everything that we probably need to talk about. So today we're going to try to focus our attention around the subjects of stroke prevention, voting rights, and continuing COVID updates. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Maxson.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neighbor Stevens, and good to see you also, Dr. Walsh. I'm glad she's got questions for you and not for me. She can be bruising in her questions.
You can.
So the Black Health Trust intends to bring you vetted information on medical subjects. For our first 2+ years, we concentrated heavily on the pandemic and COVID-19. And we've now started to add the other areas of concern, including health disparities and things that put our communities at more health risk. And I've been tapped today to give an overview on stroke prevention. And I am a kidney doctor, and that's about halfway down the body from the stroke. But let's show the slides, Simon, and I invite my co-moderators, as we usually do, to comment on the information that we present, and then we'll look at some of the other subjects. So stroke is a very important topic, both in terms of public health, and I'll have to say, and also personally. So let's go to the next slide, please. So heart disease is one of the leading causes, along with stroke, of mortality and morbidity in the United States. There are 7 rules of life. Next slide. And this could encompass the whole talk. Stop smoking if you do. Eat better if you don't. Get active if you are not. Lose weight if you need to. Manage blood pressure. And control your cholesterol and reduce your blood sugar. And up to the weight thing, we know that there are cultural differences in weight, and we know that some 80+% of Black females are obese, and probably only a slightly lesser number of Black males that are obese. And it's not because of so-called big bones that we don't eat correctly. Next slide. So stroke is the 5th leading cause of death in America. When the blood that brings oxygen to the brain stops flowing, brain cells die. On the average, someone in the United States has a stroke every 40 seconds. Black Americans have a higher prevalence of stroke and the highest death rate from stroke than any other racial group. Eating too much salt, which is sodium. Research does show that African Americans may have a gene that greatly exacerbates our sensitivity to salt and its effects. Next slide. So, stroke reduction. So since stroke is a leading cause of morbidity and mortality in North America, we know that primary prevention of stroke includes lifestyle modification and measures to control blood pressure. Cholesterol levels have to be controlled. Diabetes mellitus, if you have it, needs to be controlled. Blood sugar, even if you're not diabetic, needs to be controlled. And there's a condition of the heart beating too fast called atrial fibrillation that needs to be identified and if found, controlled. But lowering blood pressure in patients with hypertension is significantly important in both types of strokes. There's one kind of stroke called a hemorrhagic stroke, which is a blood vessel bursting and bleeding in the brain. And the other is called an ischemic stroke, where a blood vessel becomes blocked. But treating these two types by lowering your blood pressure and keeping your cholesterol and glucose under control can reduce strokes by 30 to 45%. Next slide. So what is a stroke? A stroke is sometimes called a brain attack. It occurs when something blocks a blood supply to a part of the brain, or when a blood vessel in the brain bursts. In either case, parts of the brain are damaged or die. A stroke can be can cause lasting brain damage, can cause long-term disability, and it can even cause death. Next slide. In this set of cartoons, on the left, you see a blocked artery. And in that blocked artery, the area of the brain below the blockage can die. It's called necrosis. It's called an infarct. And that is a type of stroke that can be quite damaging. It can typically be caused by either a blood clot being there, or it can be when a blood vessel is blocked by plaque, which is high lipids in some cases, and it can even be temporarily blocked for less than 36 hours, and then it's called a TIA, or transient ischemic attack. Number two is a ruptured artery, which has caused a bleeding stroke or a hemorrhagic stroke, and it shows that below the area of the bleeding that you also have necrosis of brain cells. Next slide. So there are risk factors. The higher levels of cholesterol are associated with an increased risk of ischemic stroke. You know, we used to call it hardening of the arteries. It's atherosclerosis, it's plaque, it's anything that can narrow the lumen in the blood vessel leading to areas of the brain. If you have high cholesterol, you should be treated with statins or some other agent that can reduce the risk of having high cholesterol. There's a lot of controversy over, I don't want to take statins, but sometimes those statins can save your life and can reduce fatal strokes and non-fatal strokes by up to 25%. But pairing glucose control with stroke reduction and aggressive treatment of hypertension and hyperlipidemia in patients with diabetes mellitus is recommended. There was a study done some years ago showing that if you have diabetes and you have to control both glucose and blood pressure, it is more important, even though they're both important, that you control your blood pressure aggressively. There's more life-saving events with control of blood pressure. Next slide. So strokes can happen to anyone, but they tend to be more common in older men, Black people, and Asian people. So reducing your risk to stroke or for stroke includes avoiding tobacco use, taking care of high cholesterol levels, get rid of that fried chicken and ribs, and also having an active lifestyle. Next slide. Get your blood pressure checked regularly. That's very important to do that. We have a project right now called RPM, Remote Patient Monitoring, where we can provide people with blood pressure monitors, scales, glucometers, and oximeters, but we can collect that information and provide you with information on how to keep your blood pressure under control remotely. You should avoid smoke and avoid people who smoke, and don't allow smoking in your house because secondhand smoke is sometimes more dangerous than firsthand smoke. Eat less fatty foods. Have your cholesterol levels checked regularly by your family doctor. Exercise regularly, at least 30 minutes on most days of the week. Keep your weight under control. If you have diabetes, control your blood sugar. If you don't have diabetes, control your blood sugar. And that example I've given before about creme brulee, where your high blood sugar gets converted by your normal body temperature into a plastic-like spicule that goes into your blood vessel and can cause plaques and blood vessel damage. Next slide.
Dr. Max,
Yes.
Dr. Maxey, there has been a question asked about cholesterol. How do you know that your cholesterol is high, and what is HDL and LDL?
Okay, so the way you know your cholesterol is high, in a normal sense, you have to have your blood drawn, and your doctor will order something called a lipid panel. In that lipid panel, there are several sets of elements that we will talk about. One is your total cholesterol, which should normally be below 200 milligrams %. Then there is your good cholesterol, which is HDL, and HDL should be above 70%, and HDL helps get rid of your bad cholesterol. Your bad cholesterol is called LDL, and LDL needs to be less than 100 milligrams %. And then they are your triglycerides, and we can discuss some of those as we go on. But you can't find out your cholesterol unless you have your blood drawn, unless you have severe elevated cholesterol, in which case you form these little things that turn up at the corners of your eyelids, et cetera, called atheroma. And that's when you're really out of control, when you have fat deposits in your epidermal tissue. And we can talk about those as we go later. Now, none of us like to take medicine. But if your exercise and your diet control are not taking care of your high blood pressure, your high glucose, or your cholesterol, you may have to take medicine. And that's what your medical provider or your physician can prescribe for you. And I do ascribe to the fact that you may have to take medicine. You may not have to take it lifelong, but you might need to take that medicine until you get under control where diet and exercise can adequately control it. So if you do have high blood pressure and diet doesn't control it, you need medication. Now, I give some personal recommendations that there are many types of blood pressure medicine. I advocate that the type of blood pressure medication taken by African Americans not be so-called ACE inhibitors, because one, they weren't researched on people of color. There's also more allergic reactions. And I think it's better to use something called an angiotensin receptor blocking agent, usually drugs that end in the word sartan. And they help also lower the effects of high blood pressure on your kidney by reducing pressure inside the glomerulus. There are also medicines called calcium channel blockers. And the one type of medicine that I advise against in most cases as a first-line drug is something called beta blockers. And we can talk about that later. And I have some interesting personal experience with some of these. We know there's controversy about anti-cholesterol medications, but if you need it, it might be good to temporarily take it.
Dr. Maxey, I hate to interrupt, but you've mentioned high blood pressure and lowering your blood pressure several times. And for some of the psychiatrists on the call, can you tell us what a normal blood pressure is and what it means when you say high blood pressure? What are those numbers?
It's 120/80, and I've got a slide just for you in a few minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And so it's important to know that sometimes people need to take blood thinners. It was recommended years ago that people take 81 milligrams of aspirin a day. That's good for some people, but there are risks involved. So make sure you have an idea from your doctor or provider whether that's something that's good for you. And it also has an effect in some people on helping to lower the risk of colon cancer. Next slide.
Could I just underline what you just said about consulting your physician about whether or not you are a candidate to take aspirin therapy? the guidelines on that just in the last couple of months have been changed, and it is no longer recommended that people 60 and older take aspirin for prevention of problems. And it is, again, really important that you discuss with your physician whether or not, if you're younger than 60, whether or not you should or are a candidate to take aspirin. Don't just go to the store and start popping pills.
Right. And there are other advantages of aspirin other than just high blood pressure and stroke, et cetera, but that's beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today, but you're exactly right. So antithrombotic therapy and antiplatelet therapy or anticoagulant therapy, and I won't spend any time on that, but that's something you're only going to talk about with your doctor anyway. Next slide. So you're going to see me talk about high blood pressure much on this thing. High blood pressure is the big silent killer, and it affects a lot of us, and you don't know if you have it or not in most cases. Diabetes is the other one, and heavy alcohol use is probably not that prominent on the audience that we have on this call, but the drinks that you have are very important not to over drink, and nobody should be drinking a fifth of liquor per night. And I was always taught that whatever a patient tells you that they drink, multiply it by 5. Next slide. Is that right, Dr. Walks?
I don't think that's an absolute, Dr. Maxey, but I think with some people, you may want to do that.
So I had this slide specifically for you, and I put a note to myself to have Dr. Walks navigate this slide verbally for us.
Oh, I'm happy because reading is fundamental, Dr. Maxey.
Thank you.
So this slide, do you have high blood pressure, or how do you know if you have high blood pressure? Well, blood pressure categories we have on the left, and then the upper number, the systolic number we have. And blood pressure always comes in 2 numbers. People will say something to me like, well, you know, my blood pressure is 100. No, it's not. Your blood pressure is always 2 numbers. And so when we're looking at this slide, it tells us normal blood pressure, the top number is less than 120, and the bottom number is less than 80. So Dr. Maxey mentioned earlier, normal blood pressure, 120 over 80. Great. Then we have elevated and high. And thank you, Dr. Maxey, for making this slide easy for me, because I can tell this is like one of those weather reports. When the color gets down from orange and red, it's time to get in the basement. And so with this slide, it's time to run to your doctor. And there are actually stages in this where it says consult immediately. So elevated blood pressure, 120 to 129, but still the bottom number is less than 80. High blood pressure, both the upper number and the lower number are high. 130 to 139, 80 to 89 on the lower number. And then we get into this is some real concern. High blood pressure, stage 2, 140 or higher is that upper number, and 90 or higher is the lower number. And then hypertensive crisis, where you've got to really get some help quickly. Upper number is higher than 180 and lower number is higher than 120. This is a great slide, Dr. Maxey. It's very clear, but when I just get off the treadmill, is that the time that I take my blood pressure? I've just finished doing my 4 miles and I'm sweating and I'm breathing really hard. My heart rate is up and I'm feeling really healthy. That's not when I take my blood pressure and look at these numbers, right?
No, but let's talk about that. That is an excellent time to know what that blood pressure is after you get off that treadmill, because your blood pressure is evanescent. It is meaning that it does not just stay 120 over 80, even if you're perfect. Your blood pressure is going to go up and down with emotion, with activity, etc. The way I check blood pressure, I have a person walk in place for 2 minutes in my office. And if that blood pressure exceeds that level, the second level where it says elevated, then I know that they're not properly controlled. After you exercise, after you walk, your blood pressure should not significantly go above that elevated level. Should not do that. You need to be controlled much more than that. And the only way to tell is to challenge the blood pressure. So you can be sleeping in the bed and your blood pressure is 120/80, but you walk to the kitchen to eat that bacon and it jumps up to 130/139. That's high. That means you're not controlled. So you have to take your blood pressure, maybe not exactly after you get off the treadmill, but within 10 to 15 minutes after, it should return to normal, if that answers your question. So
let me just be clear, Dr. Maxey. So no matter what I've been doing, if I sit down for about 10 to 15 minutes, my blood pressure should go back down to these levels.
yes.
Okay.
Okay, because if not, imagine that what your blood pressure is doing when it's higher than that, it's like hitting your head against a wall softly at 130 millimeters of mercury per minute. That will give you a severe headache. That can burst a blood vessel, that can exacerbate the release of a plaque. So that blood pressure is very important to be controlled most of the time. It won't be controlled all of the time, but the majority of the time, it should not go above that elevated level. Let's go to the next slide, Simon, if you would. Atrial fibrillation is something that your doctor will tell you if you have, but if you feel abnormal heartbeats, for example, when I do a pulse, if your pulse rate is 130, 140, if I hear abnormal beats, I'm going to do an EKG, but ask your doctor. If you feel your heart flipping and flopping in your chest, you need to be checked with an electrocardiogram. Let's go to the next slide. And we'll talk about extracranial, but many people have strokes related to what's going on in the carotid artery. That's a big artery in your neck where you can feel your pulse in your neck. And some people have stenosis. When your doctor examines you, not only should they listen to your heart, but they should listen to your carotid, because sometimes you can hear a murmur there or sounds there that would indicate that you have carotid plaques. And the way you test that is with a Doppler or an ultrasound. And that's something your doctor can do, and you should do that. Next slide. Intracranial stenosis, you're only going to find out if you have an MRI or MRA, and that would be a test that your doctor can order, and the appropriate therapy will be ordered from that. Next slide. So there are several studies that evaluate secondary stroke prevention. And there are some people who don't have, there's usually when you're born, there's a hole in the heart between the two atria. It's called the femoral valley. And normally that closes after the first 4 breaths or so. Is that right, Dr. Barber? The first 4 breaths that you have, it closes?
It should.
Okay, but in many cases, some cases it does not. And you'll find some adults who have persistence of that into adulthood, and sometimes it's found and it can be closed percutaneously. But again, you can find that out when your doctor does an evaluation, usually with a 2D echocardiogram or a color flow study of that. Next slide.
So Dr. Maxey, so just to clarify, the foraminal valley is an opening that connects the two sides of the heart that we don't need after the baby is born. Is that
correct?
Fair to say in layman's terms?
Correct. And if I'm right, then I'll defer to Dr. Barber, that in utero, this allows the baby to have directly high oxygenated blood to the brain in utero. But after you're born, you don't need that. Any comments on that, doctor?
That is exactly right. And if things go the way they're supposed to go with those first breaths, the signal is given and it's supposed to close. But a lot of times it doesn't.
So
it's
having
not an uncommon finding, actually.
So having a healthy baby is a miracle, I'll tell you. Patients with embolic.
Nature knows what it's doing.
Okay. I think nature's name is also God. Patients with embolic stroke, which is a stroke from blood clots of uncertain source, should not just be willy-nilly put on an anticoagulant. And also when you go to an emergency room with a stroke, which we'll talk about a little bit, you have to be careful about whether or not you want to receive the clot buster. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Let's go to the next slide. So what are the signs of a stroke? If you see facial drooping or experience facial drooping, if there's sudden numbness of the face, one side or the other, or unilateral, meaning on one side of the hands or arms or legs of numbness, if you have arm or leg weakness, if there's speech problems or even understanding problems of comprehension that's sudden in onset, or sudden onset of lack of balance, lightheadedness or dizziness, it could potentially be a stroke. Next slide. So in those cases, you want to call 911. If someone shows any of those symptoms, even if they go away. So she had it at 8 in the morning, she ate some breakfast and it all went away. Call 911 still. And try to get the exact time that the symptoms were first noted. So when you go to the emergency room, you know when the symptoms happen, because there's a clock ticking, there's a time limit in which you can be offered a clot buster. And I believe that window is about 5 to 6 hours at most. And sometimes that can be life-changing if you get the clot buster. I'm not using the appropriate pharmacological name, but it does save lives if it can reduce that clot. But there are also risks with taking it. And you must ask that radiologist. They have specific radiologists who read those and make them tell you, if you have a risk, what is the possibility that the blood clot buster will work and provide you with relief, and what is the specific risk if it doesn't, and what is the percentage? Compare those two percentages. And I've seen people go to the emergency room, they said, well, there's a 20% chance that it will make you better and a 40% chance that you will be worse. Then the answer is no, I'm not taking it. But if it gives you the right recipe of what the risks are, then you should consider taking it in consultation with the primary care doctor. There are 5 suddens that cover stroke warning signs, such as sudden numbness or weakness of the face, arm, leg, especially on one side of the body. Next slide. Next slide. If there's sudden confusion, trouble speaking or understanding, sudden trouble seeing in one or both eyes, sudden trouble in walking, dizziness, loss of balance or coordination, sudden severe headache with no known cause. If you think you or a family member may be having a stroke, call 911. Acting quickly can improve the chance of survival, improve the chance of recovery, and the doctor will do an exam and order tests, including pictures of the brain, and probably offer you, if you've been in that 5 to 6 hour window, of whether or not the clot busting injection will be of use to you. Next slide. So risk reduction, I coined the term HERRO, Health, Education, Risk Reduction Opportunities. And what we do here on Black Health Trust is HERRO, Health, Education, and Risk Reduction Opportunities. The management of vascular risk factors remains extremely important in secondary stroke prevention, meaning if you've already had a stroke or a TIA, but it's not limited to that, but it's important in diabetes, smoking cessation, lipids, and especially high blood pressure. And intensive medical management is often performed. And this is important. It's not just giving people a brochure, but actually having a program that you attend to decrease your risk. Next slide. And I use that term demographic at the end of that sentence. Everybody is not at the same risk. We know that there are lifestyle factors, including healthy diet and physical activities. They're very important. We recommend a Mediterranean diet or a DASH diet recommended for stroke risk reduction. There's a product called Mrs. Dash, and that's a diet to lower the risk reduction. It substitutes for salt without having any sodium in it. Next slide.
Dr. Maxa, you mean the Mrs. Dash seasoning that you can just buy in the grocery store, right?
Yep, and they have all sorts of flavors. They have garlic and they have regular, and I have it on my table.
And it's right in there next to the regular salt and the seasoning salt and all that.
I think so. I haven't been shopping for a while, but I think that's where it is, but it's delivered at my house. So changing patient behaviors, such as diet, and that is so difficult for a lot of us, including me, that we have to look at this diet, we have to look at exercise, and I almost call this lecture the beat up, because I'm repeating so many things that are so important. A lot of this can be handled by diet and exercise alone, and not all necessarily fancy medication. Next slide. So there's some nutritional suggestions, and I got this from nutritionists that I work with, to limit your total carbs to 30 grams or less per meal. Increase fiber to 25 grams per day for female, to 40 grams if you're a male. Avoid processed and refined foods. Center meals around 3 to 4 ounces servings of protein. Dr. Cutter, a few weeks ago in her talk on nutrition, said we should use our meat, our fish, and protein as a condiment and not the main part of the meal. So don't build a meal around the steak or the fish, make those the condiments. Eat 1 starch a day. Fresh fruits at least once per day. Vegetables at least 2 with dinner or lunch. Fresh salads 3 to 5 times a week. Choose organic produce, grass-fed meats, wild-caught salmon, pasture-raised chickens, and eggs. Next slide.
Dr. Maxey, before you leave this slide, can you just say starch is potato? Tell us about what a starch is quickly.
Starch is potato. It's pasta. It's what they call long chain, branch chain carbohydrates. But there are things
bread
and bread.
And those of us with the Caribbean background, you trying to limit our rice also?
Oh
Yeah.
man.
I'm just saying, I'm asking these questions.
You're right. So I'm in a Jamaican household, and rice is a part of every meal. At least they try to get it, at least they made it brown rice now. But you're
so all the things that you just listed, I just want to be clear. So the rice, the pasta, the potatoes, all of that stuff we have to pay attention to.
and the grits
And the starch.
and the grits.
No, we're gonna exclude grits. You can't get rid of grits. Next slide. No, grits should be out. Next slide. So everything that's good to you should be out. Get rid of, go to the next slide from this. So RWM, that's Randall W. Maxey Gourmet, comments. Roasting vegetables on high heat will sometimes caramelize them and reduce the bitterness, but you don't want to caramelize them too much. That has some effects on possibly being carcinogenic. Grilled fruits will unlock deeper sweetness. Marinating mushrooms and other vegetables in low-calorie salad dressing, like Italian dressing, lemon garlic dressing for grilling is also excellent and healthy. And my dinner tonight is going to be mostly vegetables and a little bit of fish as a condiment. Next slide.
Dr. Maxey, before you leave this slide, you mentioned low-calorie salad dressing. So many times folks will think they're eating a healthy salad and they've just poured 500 calories of salad dressing on it.
Well, I should put a limited amount.
Well, there is no excuse for that, because salad dressings are very simple to make yourself. And you can certainly make a low-calorie Italian with a little vinegar and a little olive oil and some Italian seasoning, and you won't have your carbs. So we need to get back to making stuff ourselves.
And Ivan, I don't know if you got the invitation, but I got invited to Tampa, Florida, to have personal meals made by the famous Dr. Nabert. Next slide.
I did not get invited. I'm very sad right now.
So oils you should cook with. They should be oils that don't oxidize when they're heated, such as avocado oil and coconut oil. Olive oil is good for salads, but not for heating and cooking. Next slide.
Shouldn't be frying that much anyway.
So exercise is key to most things in life, but you don't have to exercise for 2 hours like Dr. Walks does. You can break that up into 10 to 15-minute periods a day, so you don't kill yourself and sweat up all your clothes so your wife has to take them to the laundry. You should quit smoking and should not be around people who smoke or let them in your house. And after 20 minutes of quitting smoking, already your blood sugar, your blood pressure starts to go down, your heart rate returns to normal. So you can see an immediate reduction when you stop smoking. Next slide. So getting enough rest makes you less likely to crave sugar, fatty foods that provide quick energy. You don't need to turn yourself into a pretzel to meditate. Find positions that are comfortable. You don't have to be a guru or whatever those people who meditate in India. Just find a quiet corner and reduce your mental activity and pressure. A few minutes of meditation each day can create a positive influence on well-being. Is that true, Dr. Walks?
That is true, Dr. Maxey.
Good. And do not overlook your emotional and mental health if you need to manage stress, anxiety, depression, or grief. Sometimes you need to talk to somebody and let it out. Holding it in is not going to help at all. Being the strong, stiff upper lip, big he-man, big she-woman, you got to reduce that stress, reduce that grief. And if I'm right, most grief, especially over death, is not about who died, but about how it affects you. So it's sort of selfish anyway. So we got to find a way to control it. Next slide.
But that's not to say, and I'm getting ready to step into a lane I shouldn't step into, but that's not to say that grief is not normal and necessary.
No, it's normal, it's necessary, but it needs to be handled correctly. And most people do not handle it just themselves. There's grief therapy. There's a whole philosophy around why we have funerals. And funerals are aimed at the living and the grieving, not at the dead. But that's another talk. So let's go to the next slide, Simon.
I think that was it, Dr. Maxey.
That's it. So in terms of reducing stress, get enough rest, get enough stopping smoking, control your blood pressure, control your meals and your salt, especially. There's a gene called the APO1, APO2 that's been identified in Blacks that can make you more liable to have kidney failure and have more effects from eating salt. And that's why we have a lot of our problems. And I thank you for attention. I welcome any questions that are out there or any comments.
Well, I want to make a comment again back to the cooking. So besides buying this dash, you know, you can also grow your own herbs. And I happen to have been in Big Lots yesterday, which is one of my favorite stores. And they had several different varieties of little windowsill size herb gardens. And so, you know, you don't have to have 4 acres to grow it. You can grow it in your house. Even if you're in an apartment, you can grow it in your apartment. So you might want to consider raising a little herb garden to help season your cooking.
That's good. And also using lemon juice can help a lot with flavor. For people that don't have kidney problems now, because lemon has a lot of potassium in it, but lemon juice can flavor salads and foods, you know, and avoid the use of salt. We tend to equate something tasting good with how salty it is, at least in many of our communities. In my house, if it was salty, it was good, but we know that it wasn't good for you. And salt is bad in the sense that it will help bring more fluid, more water inside your blood vessels. And therefore it increases your blood pressure. It's like putting a thumb on a hose to make the water squirt further. And not only does it increase the pressure within the lumen of the hose, but it also increases the salt within the blood vessel walls and makes them fatter. and that makes your blood pressure higher. I think in engineering, that is the law of Laplace. If I'm not mistaken, that makes your blood flow faster and makes it also more pressure, and that cannot be good. Anything in the chat we need to answer or address? Dr. Neighbor, Dr. Walks?
There was a question, and I'm going to show my bias towards primary care. There was a question, and so if there are any cardiologists on the Zoom today, I'm not addressing this to you personally, but if you are under the care of a good internist or family practice physician, they are perfectly adequate in directing your care. But the caveat to that is that if they are good. And second, the caveat to that is, as you know, we are always stressing the principle of personal advocacy. So if you feel that you need to see a cardiologist, then you should see a cardiologist.
Let me comment on that, not in real disagreement, but if your primary care doctor, and I do take the caveat in saying they're qualified doctors, they should be able to address most of your problem. I see a primary care doctor in the football game as being a quarterback. And sometimes you'll want to pass that ball to an end. Sometimes you'll want to give it to a halfback, a fullback, and in some cases he may give it to a tackle, who knows? But somebody has to be the director of the show, and that's what a primary care doctor is. But the key thing to being a primary care doctor is to know the limits of your capability and know when something needs a more well-versed input on a specific thing. For example, if I have a patient with atrial fibrillation, I know what atrial fibrillation is, but it's not in my lane to be the primary treater of that. I'm going to ask for a cardiologist. If somebody has a depression, I know about depression, but I'm going to refer that patient to Dr. Walks. I know about a foramen ovale, but if a patient of mine has the foramen ovale and they're less than 18 years old, I'm going to call Dr. Neighbor Stevens. So it's just a matter of being an appropriate quarterback and knowing how to use the tools at your disposal. And primary care doctors are the quarterback, and those of us that are subspecialists hope that the appropriate quarterback calls on us when there's something in our lane. Now, there's overlap in all of the different professions. As a nephrologist, what's in my lane is endocrinology, pulmonology, cardiology, hypertension, and everything, but I don't get too far out on those limbs. So just because you want to see a cardiologist, I don't think people should just say that. Ask your doctor if you need a cardiologist. And hopefully if you trust him or her, you'll listen to their judgment. You shouldn't just say, I'm going to see a cardiologist. That may not be the best thing for you.
I would like to point to Dr. Walks now, continuing the football metaphor. So Dr. Walks, we've been talking about high blood pressure and the role that stress plays in either causing or making your high blood pressure worse. Given the events of yesterday in Buffalo and the acknowledged direct assault that it was intended to be on the Black community, how can we effectively protect ourselves from the stress that we are having to deal with in this country and not make our blood pressure worse or any of the other outcomes that one can experience from trauma? And that was indeed a trauma.
So, Dr. Neighbor Stevens, you're talking about a young white man deciding that he's going to get in his car and go hunt Black people in a grocery store.
That would
and
be
then the police coming and very nicely arresting him and taking him away very, very gently and kindly. Is that what you're talking about?
That would be what I am referring to.
Yeah. I had a very difficult time with that. And I think before I get to what people do, I think it's important for us to talk about how it impacts us. I thought immediately about Reverend Pointer, who is up, I think, in the Buffalo area, and is a pastor that is a very good friend of the Black Health Trust and is one of our key people that is with us a lot. I thought about a niece I had that lived up there. I thought about how I'm connected there, right? I gave a commencement address at a school up there once. There's so much about what connects us to places other than the fact that there's a crazy white man that thinks it's okay to go hunt Black people with multiple rifles. It's awful. It's absolutely awful. So I think the first thing we do is we accept that it bothers us, that it impacts us. It made me sad. It made me profoundly sad when I heard that story yesterday, and I needed to talk about it. And I talked to people about it, about what happened, how bad it was for those people, how I felt for Reverend Pointer and the other people that may have been impacted by that. And I talked about how it made me feel. It made me feel sick. It made me feel unsafe. It made me feel that, is he the only one that's out hunting Black people? And it made me angry that people just kind of, hold his hands and put handcuffs on him and put him in a car. Nobody kneeled on his neck. Nobody punched him in the face. Nobody shot him. All the things that really bothered me. So I think to answer the question about what we do, I think the first thing is that we allow it to hit us. We allow it to come in and allow it to hurt and allow it to impact us. And then we try, going back to what Dr. Maxey mentioned earlier, to now don't let it kill us. Don't let it stay with us. One of the most powerful things I heard was Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, I think is her name. I'm blanking on it now because I'm just inundated with the images of this horrific event up in Buffalo. When she was asked about the assault that took place on her when she was being interviewed for the United States Supreme Court, I remember listening to her talk about how she persevered through that and how it was, and for me, it was a triumphant thing to hear her talk about that in a triumphant way, because I got through that and I'm moving on past that. And I think that that's where we have to go. We have to hold hands and carry each other to a place where we can say, you know what? There are going to be crazy people out there. They're going to be crazy Black people. They're going to be crazy white people. It's the world in which we live. And I don't know why they do what they do. I don't know why it was a crazy man that did what he did. And I'm not going to let him off and say that he has a mental health problem and that excuses everything. I'm not ready to go there. I don't know enough information to go there. But I do know that we can persevere through things like that if we're willing to accept none of that stiff upper lip stuff that Dr. Maxey said doesn't work anyway, but embracing the construct that mental health is a part of the healthcare process. It's a part of all of the things that we have access to, that your primary care doctor can refer you to and can help you with. And we persevere and we go on. This place ain't easy, but that's what I have, knowing what I know at this point, Dr. Neighbor-Stevens.
I see Dr. Jordan's hand waving. Can you unmute Dr. Jordan?
Yes, thank you. I like what was just said. However, I don't want us to categorize this young man as being mentally ill.
Right.
Yeah. I come from the South, and every white person who tried to hurt us was not mentally ill. And I think we should take the aggressive form to make sure he doesn't get categorized in that and just be lumped, period. But I would hope that someone would try to determine what caused this probably poor, unaccomplished white kid to feel he has been left behind this far and feels he has the privilege to go out and start shooting folks because he is not leading the race. So I think the NMA, Black folks should push to make sure he's just not excused. Had he been Black and doing that, the police would have treated him, I think, very differently. But I was, I think I was madder at how they treated him. Going back to South Carolina, when that guy shot all the folks in the church, they treated him well, stopped and let him get lunch. So, I mean, that's a difference. And that's where, to me, policing needs to be addressed, because to me, that shouldn't have happened.
So Dr. Jordan, when I use the word crazy, it has nothing to do with mental health. It's when I can't put something together. I did say I don't know anything about his mental health, and I'm not ready to have anybody tell me that he had a mental health problem. I am not ready for that. I think that when you go into a place where primarily Black people are and start hunting us, that has nothing to do with mental health in my mind. You gotta convince me. You gotta bring a whole lot of convincing to me. I just think it's crazy. I think it's got to stop. And I agree with you. I'm not ready to say people need to be mishandled by the police. Nobody should be mishandled by the police. At the same time, if you can handle some people a certain way, handle all of us that way. Handle all of us as if we're human beings.
So
when you interact with us.
Let me comment on some of what you're saying. There's a word that I learned when I was in medical school. Maybe you've heard of it before, but in particular, when we were so-called revolutionaries, back in the so-called day, Dr. Jordan, and back when I could grow hair and had a huge fro. So, and the night they killed Martin Luther King, a lot of us went into the street with total frustration. And we were trying to obtain some relief from hurting something or somebody or something, because if you kill the most peaceful among us, then it was over. So I made myself want to be nihilistic, self-destructive, because there was no physical win. There was going to be no thing other than I feel good because I burned something up or I broke a window. So we have to be careful about not being nihilistic. But at the other hand, on the other side, you do not want to do nothing. You do not want to say, we're just going to have to accept it. That is the world we live in. That is the country we live in. No. We do have to, in a very circumspect, strategic way, develop plans to stop this, because it is malignant. I'm concerned about what we talked about the other week on the Supreme Court. Now, I'm not all that invested in abortion, but I am invested in what getting rid of settled law by the Supreme Court means to all the other things, such as voting rights, the rights that we have to even vote, to be free, to have marriage of people in different groups. I think all of that is at risk. And if we stand by and stay totally uninvolved and let these things happen, we're going to be extinct real quick. But I do not believe that the majority population in this country has included us in the human race. And we know that right now, a lot of people that are white, this guy included, they believe that people of color are replacing them, and so-called replacement theory. And we have to fight that. We don't have to do it necessarily by going up and looting and burning down stuff. But people
that's
of
not
color,
doing it.
What? But
No,
we
that's
have
not doing it. But you're right. We
Yeah.
have to.
we have
And
to
we
do
need to
it.
look back and realize from whence we came. I mean, it's a lot better now, but we came out of hell. Particularly me and you, because we come from that generation.
Yeah. So when I talk about Frederick Douglass, he's a pretty famous guy. He said something, I know I'm going to butcher his quote, but he said, power gives nothing that power doesn't take. Did I say that right, Dr. Neighbor? Power concedes what power demands. So we have to find in certain circles, maybe with people of the ilk of Dr. Carl Brooks, who headed up the largest group of Fortune 500 Black executives on the planet, who have the financial wherewithal, maybe not the political will, but we have to find ways that are not nihilistic to make sure that we survive as a, I don't know if we're a race, a community, or whatever we are, but this is planned and it's malignant, and these people are playing the long game. It's not about 2 or 3 people getting shot. It's about your future as a recognized human group, and we must act on the same level of strategy that the majority groups do. And I'll leave it at that.
Dr. Maxey, you got your point across. The quote, I just looked it up. Don't let me act like I'm real smart and know everything. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will.
Well, good. Did I have it right? Was it Frederick Douglass?
It was Frederick Douglass, and you had it right enough for us to understand. Look, it isn't about how smart you are and who you can quote. It's about, are you communicating effectively? You communicated effectively the point that Frederick Douglass was making, and it's an appropriate point.
Mr. Brooks, are you available to make a comment on what we're talking about? Can you unmute Mr. Brooks, Simon?
Randall, Drina and I are sitting here watching the program, and the program is excellent, absolutely excellent. The doctors are fabulous. This country is in such terrible shape right now that it's scary to me. And growing up in South Philly, like I grew up in South Philly, and doing the things that we've done, and Randall was our doctor at the Executive Leadership Council. We had the benefit of having a team of Black doctors work with us. And it was interesting. Things have changed so much in the last presidential, the Trump era and everything. This country is in trouble. I'm concerned about my grandkids that are 7 and 10. I'm concerned about my daughter and my son. I'm concerned about life right now because white people for the last 20 years have sensed that their population wasn't growing the way minority populations are growing. And the whole diversity movement was a way of them understanding how to deal with that. They deal with it with voting laws. They deal with it all crazy kind of ways. And this thing has been taken to such an extreme that this country is in trouble. And if we intelligent African-Americans and intelligent white people don't put their heads together, this country is set for a disaster in the future. I'm very, very concerned about this country right now.
Let me ask you a quick question. In terms of the statement that Dr. Walks just made, power concedes nothing that power doesn't demand. Give us a 30-second summary of what kind of power the people of the Executive Leadership Council have, and are there any other power groups we should start to coalesce to talk about ways and means to protect our communities, as an example? I hate to put you on the spot, but the player.
Randall, it's interesting though, because the group, the Executive Leadership Council, was made up of the top African-American executives in Fortune 500 companies. You had to be within 2 levels of a CEO in Fortune 500 company to be a member. When I retired from that, the group does now continue to do, focusing on young people, focusing on membership. It's also focusing on entrepreneurs, Black enterprise, and other companies which bring together the best and brightest of that community. It should be an asset to us, and it will be. But we got to develop and identify other assets that we can use during these troubled times. Church is one way of doing it, but we got to educate ourselves. I'm fearful with my grandchildren. I'm fearful with my son, who's very visible. He runs a $2.5 billion company. He's exposed tonight on, Puffy Combs is doing something on television tonight, and Tarek will be there as he does that. I'm concerned about the world that we're facing right now. White people are jealous of a lot of the things that we do, and they're reacting to it as though we're taking something away from them. This is a very, very difficult time for this country.
Good. I'm going to call on another gentleman who's going to kill me because I'm calling on him. Mr. Simon Cooper, what are your thoughts about how we protect our communities?
Okay, you did put me on the spot. I think it starts at home, to be 100% honest with you. It starts at home. We have to be an example for the people that are looking at us, the younger generations. I won't get much into it, but I wasn't always a productive member of society, but I do everything in my power to make sure my son doesn't have to make those choices, doesn't have those bad choices in front of him that I had. So that when he goes out into the world as a young man, he turned 14 today, actually, and it scares the heck out of me that he's that old and is going to be out on his own more and more as a young Black man. But I've done everything that I could, that I've learned from my parents and from the elder generation on how to raise him to be respectful to people, to be kind to people, and to always know he doesn't have to follow a crowd. Do what he knows is the best thing to do. And I feel by having the younger generation understand and appreciate that, and we take that on ourselves to drill that into them, that'll start to make the ripple effect of change. Because a lot of the problems that people have are because of unstable homes, and that translates out into the community, which affects everyone else. So if we get our homes together and raise our kids to be the best possible people that they can be, that'll make a world of change when we send them out into the world.
Thank you. I called Dr. Reverend Pointer yesterday after the news came on about the city, and I was calling him to basically express my anger and to say I was going to strap up, which I wasn't going to strap up and get my AR-15 and come to Buffalo and help out. But the message that he had, he didn't answer the phone, and I got his phone message. It was one of prayer and peace, and it just took all the wind out of my sails because I was getting ready to say some crazy stuff, nihilistic things, as opposed to strategic approaches to this. And I said that we would be in prayer for not only the situation in Buffalo, but in the situation that we face, because we do have to face some overwhelming problems of politics, of racism, of the country that is the most militant military power on earth, of people who don't consider that we're even part of the human race. And I do believe that spiritual power, in fact, there's a saying that used to be on my church wall saying, not by power, not by might, but by my spirit, saith the Lord. And I do believe that that is the ultimate, but we also need some political, financial power in what we have to do. And before we had the Black Health Trust, we had what's called the strategic round table of military leaders, of political leaders, and people in all the fields to look at what was happening as we were going into this pandemic. And I probably want to reconvene that. We had some very interesting talks on that. But I'm interested, Dr. Neighbor and Dr. Walks, in all the subjects that we had as we needed to talk about the COVID update, about the voting rights, about the Supreme Court. But I'd like to just hear from a couple of our people on the call, just what they think a minute, and then finish up with some of those items if we don't mind. I'd like to do that. So I'm going to open the floor for just a few minutes. I don't want uncontrolled conversation, but I'd like to hear from a few people who've been on our calls that have something to say. Is Dr. Rhonda Johnson on? She always
Yes,
has
she is.
She always has something perfect to say.
Yeah, no pressure, Dr. Johnson. Just something perfect, as Dr. Maxey requested.
Hello, everyone. I don't think I have anything perfect to say. I think it's a very complicated problem. You know, this whole Buffalo issue speaks to everything you all have said, but we can't get around the reality of racism in this country. And what's so sad is that the younger generation now, this young generation should not, they've grown up in a very diverse America, an extremely diverse America for the most part. And so how they could have these hatred deep embedded, I mean, this man wrote a 180-page manifesto, and you know what I mean, his social media, and he even live streamed it. This is just very sad. The other issue, of course, is the access to guns. We live in a society that is just, when I was in pediatric practice, one of my patients told me, Dr. Johnson, he was 14 years old. He said, I could get you a gun for $25 and have it here in the next 15 minutes. Now, this was in one of our neighborhoods, but gun accessibility, availability, high-grade military ammunition, it's just too easy. And we're dealing with a very powerful gun manufacturing and gun lobby and industry. So we will, to solve this problem, it requires, it requires a whole multifaceted approach that is bigger than any single one of us individually and maybe even collectively. But I agree, you know, there are moments when you realize something must be done. And Dr. Walks, I agree with everything you said. The anger I felt, that God was just standing there waiting to be something to happen to him. And the police were just looking at him like they were paralyzed. It is just, you know, it sends such a message of entitlement that it's okay to kill Black people. Right. And you'll get away with it. That was the image that I took away. So I don't have anything great to contribute. It is a very bad day, literally.
Well, that what you said was perfect. You don't have to be a doctor to talk on this program, but I'm gonna call on another doctor I see, Dr. Lisa Kervin-Dawes, who did her medical training in the United States, but she now is in the lovely island of Jamaica, where I hope to be at the end of the month. Dr. Kervin-Dawes. But if anybody else wants to speak, I want you to raise your hand so Simon can unmute you. Dr. Kervin-Dawes, are you available?
You know, while we're unmuting Dr. Kerwin-Dawes, you know, Dr. Maxey, Dr. Kerwin-Dawes is 159% busy. And though she is always on the Black Health Trust, she's liable to be pulled away during the meeting and maybe not be right in front of her computer right now.
That's correct. So I see Mr. Herb Dorsey from Louisiana. Can you get away from chasing alligators for a minute to make a comment, Mr. Dorsey? I want to open the floor just a moment. You don't have to be a member of our medical advisory or have an MD or a PhD to speak.
I see Dr. Gibson is unmuted.
Dr. Gibson?
Yes, I feel compelled to circle back to the comments that Simon made. My father used to say a lot, charity starts at home and spreads abroad. So we have to reach out to our immediate and nuclear families and strengthen those cores, strengthen those values, and teach. Each one teach one, Reverend Jackson used to say. And that's really probably the most basic and fundamental way we can approach the catastrophe we see all around us that we interpret as the quote unquote real world, because it's only going to get crazier right now. Conditions are with all the economic and geopolitical stuff we're looking at on the news cycles nonstop. So we have to make sure that we touch our families and understand that we're all part of an extended family and treat each one of our folks and your folks, your neighbors' folks like family, and we'll be much stronger for it.
Amen. Well said.
Thank you. Thank you. So I guess we have to get back to our program. It doesn't seem that people want to talk too much.
Doc,
Yes, who's that? Herb?
Mr. Dorsey.
bringing everybody's memory back to the fact that LBJ was a Dixiecrat until he served with John F. Kennedy and was basically forced to sign the Equal Voting Rights Act. And once he did that, he was asked why poor white Republicans repeatedly vote against their own best interests. And this is what his response was to that reporter. If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't know you're picking his pocket. Hell, he'll give someone to look down on. He'll even empty his pockets for you. This is the reality that we have lived in since we've been here. It has not changed. And I don't care what kind of psychology or flim-flamming of the definitions of words that we try to use to explain where we are. That's a reality that we need to keep on our minds.
Excellent point.
Yeah. Dr. Sherrod has her hand up, Dr. Maxey.
Okay, Dr. Sherrod. Can you unmute Dr. Sherrod?
Let's see. Hello.
Hello,
Yeah,
Dr.
can you all hear
Sherrod.
me? Yeah. Hello. How are you all today?
Good.
I'm so sorry that I got on late, but I'm just listening to the conversation and I'm really surmising. I don't know the specifics, but I kind of have an idea of what you've been talking about. But I wanted to go back to Simon again about starting at home because, I grew up, I'm from a family of 11. I had 7 brothers and 3 sisters. And my father was self-educated. He only went to 4th grade. But I can remember him. I only had 1 brother younger. All the other 6 were older. He would talk with them about how to interact, and I'm talking about violence, with the police. Even back then, back in the day, he told them, if you're ever stopped by a policeman, be very humble. Do not try to challenge them. Try to adhere to their commands. So the teaching at home, I think, is very, very important. And I have no brothers who had major conflicts out of the 7 with policemen. And I think about that. And I give the credit to my father. I think he's brilliant. He was brilliant, even though he didn't get a formal education. But I have major concerns too about what's going on in this country in general, as other people have voiced. We don't really have a voting rights bill anymore. Whoever thought the voting rights bill would be up for question again, and then they're slowly taking away rights and exhibiting more control in a democratic, quote unquote, society, supposedly.
I heard a comment this morning, Dr. Jesse, from Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who I generally tend to respect. But she said something that sounded very suspect to me. She was asked, why have not the Democrats dealt with some of these issues? And she said, well, who would have thought that somebody like Donald Trump would get elected? Who would have thought that the Supreme Court would be turned into right wing? Who would have thought any of these things would happen? How can somebody who's a 3rd heartbeat person from the president of the United States not have thought, not have seen that there's a malignancy going on about racism in our country? That took all of my respect away from her. How could she not have thought about it? That tells me that the people we're counting on, supposedly people that are Democrats, supposedly the people that respect Black, they don't give a crap either. None of them.
Well, look, I'm going to agree with you, and it's going to sound like a conspiracy theory, but in general, I think we have to keep in mind that I don't believe in Democrats and Republicans per se, because I think they all have a common goal, and they just approach this goal in a different way. The Democratic way appears to be considering us more, but in reality probably is not. I think their common goal is white supremacy. And I hate to say that. And that's why we have, the system was built on racism and controlling the Black population, because we were the infrastructure for building this society. And I often say we are trying to imitate a society whose infrastructure was constructed by slaves. And we're trying to live that same lifestyle without slaves. And that's why we're all burning ourselves out. But see, I think one comment that you made, Maxie, that was very, very important is that we've been able to survive all of this because of our spirituality.
Close it down.
And that's the God power from within, because the supremacy thinking is that power is money. And, we had no money, but yet here we are competing with them, not on a level playing ground, but able to actually exceed them and make some advances without, quote unquote, the money power. So the spirituality thing for us, I think, is very, very important. But so how do you get down to this real thing? Is this whole system, which was built to be the way it is, has to be revived.
Well, I agree with you, Dr. Jesse. I appreciate it. We're at our time where we have to get moving. I'm going to ask our co-moderators to make final observations and comments. And Dr. Hines isn't with us today, right, Dr. Walks?
That's correct. Dr. Hines will be back with us next week.
Okay, very good. So if Dr. Walks, if you would have some final observations you'd like to make, followed by Dr. Nabert, and then we will adjourn until same time next week.
Dr. Maxey, I have conservatively about an hour and a half worth of comments about the things we've talked about today. So I will try to condense those down into about 30 to 40 seconds, because
you want to get beat up by the Tennessee militia?
No, I think Dr. Jordan will give me one of those looks, and that'll get me to be quiet. But let me say a couple of things. First, I'll comment on the most recent things we've been discussing. Then I want to go back to where we started today with our health related to stroke and what have you. In terms of what we've just been talking about, the one place that I don't know how to be comfortable is in a place of helplessness or powerlessness. I don't know how to sit there. I'm very uncomfortable with that. So I don't believe that we are in a place where we are subject to anybody else's things that they want to do to us. I don't believe that. And I don't believe that that the white people are whatever the white people are doing. I think some people are doing some things, but I think it's about us. I think it's about what we do. It's about us deciding that we're going to encourage each other to get out and vote in any way we can. I think it was Michelle Obama that was talking to folks about, or somebody else was talking about, take a lunch, take a bottle of water, get ready to stand out there on that line, get out there and vote. We have seen people that are small in numbers change things in this country because they are willing to stand online under any circumstances and vote. They are willing to speak their truth in a way that impacts other people. If everybody in every one of our neighborhoods got out and voted as much as they can now, we would be able to change the rules so more can vote later. I believe that. So I'm not going to be helpless. I'm not going to feel anybody is in charge of me or the boss of me. I'm going to encourage the folks around me to do everything that we can to make our position better. That's what I got to say about that. In terms of the health things, Dr. Maxey, we talked about some really important stuff today. And the one thing I want to add to what we talked about, in addition to how we're going to eat better, how we're going to exercise better, the way we'll season our food and choose our food better, is that we have got to advocate with the people who are our doctors and our nurse practitioners. A couple of things on the list, Dr. Maxey, you had, if you feel dizzy or and even if it goes away, go to the doctor right away. There are some things in that sudden stroke list that when people that look like us show up at the emergency room, we get dismissed. Oh, well, you feeling better? Go back home. And I think it's important for us to talk with each other about the fact that there are times when, because we look like we look, we are going to be dismissed when we come with those concerns. And we have to be advocating for ourselves in those environments, because science, data, research has shown that we don't get the same treatment. Same complaint, same money, same insurance, different treatment. So I wanted to add that to what we talked about today with respect to us advocating for better health. We do what we can at home. We eat better, we exercise, take our blood pressure, take our blood sugar, all of that. And then when we have an issue, we advocate for it. One last little comment. Dr. Gibson always puts this in the chat about the importance of the pharmacists in our community as a resource. Pharmacists are a huge resource, and they can give us a lot of good information. I want to toss that in.
Excellent, excellent. Dr. Barbara Neighbor Stevens.
Well, I think my comments are going to be very brief because I am weighed down by the situation that we are in. And as Dr. Johnson said, there are multiple components and reasons for us being at the point that we're at today. And I think it doesn't do it justice to throw out simplistic remedies without careful thought and strategic analysis and planning. But I would end, as I always do, that given where we are and what's going on, use common sense and be careful.
Amen.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to end with two things. And I debated whether I should do it, but I'm going to do it. So we all talk about need for health. And one of the things that the Bible says that it's good to do when you confess your sins one to another. And in that manner, I'm an extremely well-educated physician, pharmacist, pharmacologist, nephrologist, and mortician. And I specialize in the use of drugs and medications. However, in a lapse of whether it be judgment or do what you tell other people to do, I found myself a few weeks or months back having a significant medical issue that was uncalled for because I did not control my blood pressure, did not adequately control my diet. And I say this, that as a physician with all of those letters behind my name, I was lax on that. So it's not hard for me to understand how a person in the community with no letters after their name can easily be lulled into the fact, well, I'm just going to eat this steak once. I'm just going to eat this fried fish once, because it's never once. So in the matter of saying that I apologize for not treating my God-given health exactly correctly, and even I'm a physician. So we should all consider this health we have, this body we have, as a gift from God. And it is very important for us to be good stewards. And God said that if you're faithful over a few things, I'll give you leadership and control over a lot. So I'm inspired every week by Dr. Neighbor Stevens because I ask her what she's cooking. So what I'm cooking, as I close, I have some fish. I'm not going to eat more than 4 ounces. And I'm going to cook it on the grill on a wood plank. I'm going to have some bell peppers marinated, some mushrooms marinated, some, what are those long green things? Not string beans.
Asparagus.
Asparagus. And I'm going to, and some apples. I'm going to have those grilled after being marinated in a little bit of homemade oil and vinegar. And that is going to be my dinner for this evening. And I'm not going to have a juice drink. I'm going to have water. And that's going to be my meal for the night. And I invite other people to do the same. Thank you so much for joining us on this Sunday on the Black Health Trust. Have a safe, happy rest of your day.
Have a good day, everyone.